The first sign of failure wasn't an explosion or a scream, but silence, the kind that felt unnatural inside the darkened operations room buried deep within a reinforced compound in Saigon, where Specialist Daniel Mercer leaned toward the curved glass of his CRT monitor. Its cold green glow washing over his tired face, while machines around him whispered with absolute confidence. Millions of dollars of American surveillance technology, acoustic sensors, seismic detectors, thermal arrays, feeding their electronic pulse into this room to form what commanders proudly called the electronic wall. An invisible barrier of silicon and code no army was supposed to cross. Yet tonight Mercer saw nothing, his fingers adjusting the gain dial as the high-pitched hum vibrated into his skull through his headset. Every footstep in the jungle meant to appear as a clean spike, every movement translated into certainty, yet the screen remained empty, too empty, and behind him his supervisor muttered to run the sweep again, so Mercer obeyed, scanning the sensor fields scattered across hundreds of miles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but again nothing appeared. Even though hours earlier reconnaissance had photographed deep truck tracks proving thousands of enemy soldiers were moving, and Mercer felt doubt tighten in his stomach as he tapped the glass, as if the truth was stuck behind it, because somewhere out there an army existed that the machines insisted did not, while far away under the suffocating jungle canopy. Why Captain Nguyen Phuc Bao stood ankle-deep in mud, listening to the breathing of his army, 40,000 men moving without engines, without voices, without metal, only the wet, rhythmic thud of boots pulling free from thick silt, sweat soaking their uniforms, mosquitoes feeding freely. Leeches clinging as they carried weapons, ammunition, and rice on their backs, Bao moving silently beside them with his hand grazing tree trunks, feeling the scale of his invisible force. Knowing the Americans were listening, knowing they trusted their machines, remembering the plan explained weeks earlier in a dim bunker, how the Americans had built a technological god, and the only way to defeat it was to give it nothing to hear, so engines were abandoned, radios forbidden. Even conversation reduced to breath and gesture, mud swallowing heat, leaves swallowing sound, the jungle itself turning traitor against the sensors, while above them American aircraft prowled blindly, their sophisticated systems designed by the brilliant engineers of the United States Department of Defense, searching desperately for signals that never came. And back in Saigon, Mercer replayed the data again and again, his mouth dry, whispering that they had to be there, yet the machines offered only static, and for the first time he felt exposed. Not physically but intellectually, realizing the technology could be blind, while in the jungle Bao suddenly raised his fist, and 40,000 men froze instantly into absolute silence, even their breathing restrained as distant aircraft engines rumbled overhead hunting ghosts, Bao staring into the darkness without fear, because he understood something the Americans did not, that technology could listen, but it could not understand, and when he lowered his hand the army moved again. Boots pressing into mud that erased their existence, while Mercer stared at the empty screen. His reflection staring back like an accusation, realizing that somewhere out there an entire army was moving toward war, and America's most expensive eyes had just been blindfolded by mud and leaves, and the most terrifying truth was not that the enemy was coming, but that they were already close. The first thing Sergeant Mick Blue Callahan noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, which would have been easier to comprehend, but a silence that pressed inward from every direction, thick and heavy, wrapping the patrol as they moved through the Vietnamese highlands like swimmers pushing through dark water. Above him, 3 layers of jungle canopy strangled the sky, towering teak and dipterocarp trees interlocking so completely that even sunlight struggled to penetrate. What little light survived fell in fractured, pale green shards that never quite touched the forest floor. He paused, raising a closed fist, and the Australian SAS reconnaissance patrol behind him froze instantly, 8 men absorbed into the terrain itself. Blue listened, expecting the jungle's normal life, the chatter of insects, birds, distant monkeys, but there was only the slow, wet breathing of the earth. Crouching lower, face inches from the ground, the smell hit him first. That rich, organic rot of decomposing leaves and damp soil, thick, sweet, ancient. He pressed a palm gently against the surface. It felt wrong, too firm, not the forgiving texture of natural forest floor. Brushing aside a thin layer of leaves, he found the edge, a seam no wider than a fingernail, a circular lid of earth reinforced with woven roots and clay, camouflaged with moss and leaf litter. Even knowing it was there, his eyes struggled to hold on to it. Respect flickered through him. Beneath his hand, a human had labored for weeks to disappear completely. He signaled the others silently, "Don't touch it, don't disturb the illusion," because the illusion was the weapon. Thousands of miles away, American engineers in air-conditioned command centers had designed Operation Igloo White, a billion-dollar system of sensors disguised as plants and animal droppings, listening for vibrations, heat, and sweat, relaying signals to orbiting aircraft. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was blind. Captain Nguyen Thai Vinh knelt in darkness. Lantern light flickering against clay walls reinforced with bamboo, widening a tunnel by centimeters. Damp and mineral-rich air clung to him, the tunnel's depth insulated against infrared detection, Earth absorbing heat and diffusing it into the planet itself, rendering this place invisible to the sensors above. Nguyen's fingers traced the cool tunnel wall. Earth was the ultimate camouflage. Erasing movement, heat, presence. Above ground, the forest amplified the deception. Triple canopy fractured sound, softened rotor blades to meaningless vibrations, scattered radio waves. Trapped heat diffused infrared. Nature did not merely conceal, it protected. Blue, prone on a ridgeline, watched figures moving along a jungle path, each pushing a reinforced bicycle loaded with supplies, heavy loads carefully balanced to dampen seismic signature. Igloo White's sensors detected nothing. All that technology was defeated by a simple machine invented a century before. This was adaptive warfare, horizontal and invisible. American commanders stared at empty screens, frustrated. Colonel Robert Hastings whispered, "We know they're moving, so where the hell are they?" Data revealed gaps, entire regiments appearing and disappearing without trace. It violated everything learned about modern war. War was supposed to be visible, trackable, controllable, yet this enemy had refused the sky, abandoned detection, fought through tunnels. Roots Earth itself. Back in the jungle, Blue exhaled slowly, recognizing that what he saw was not chaos but deliberate design. Spider holes, tunnels, reinforced bicycles, all part of the doctrine of the low, a patient, disciplined engineering of invisibility. Pressing his hand against the forest floor again, he sensed the presence of someone beneath. Still, silent, invisible, and realized the deeper they became part of the jungle, the less even the most advanced machines could hope to perceive them. Long before the bombs fell, before the gunships carved their violence into the canopy, there was a different kind of battlefield unfolding in absolute silence. It began not with explosions, but with footsteps that refused to exist. His name was Lamb, though no American pilot would ever know it, and even among his own unit, names were rarely spoken aloud once the march began. Names were luxuries of peace. Here, on the narrow arteries of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, identity dissolved into function. He was simply a porter, a body, a pair of legs beneath 60 kilograms of war. The bamboo yoke across his shoulders had long ago reshaped his skeleton. It pressed into the same grooves every day, carving familiar lines of fire along his collarbones. 2 ammunition crates hung from either side, swaying with every step, their weight alive, their balance delicate. If he stumbled, even slightly, the entire load could shift, throwing him sideways into the mud or worse, into sound. The sound was death. The jungle at night enforced this law with suffocating authority. At 2:00 a.m., there was no wind, no insects dared to sing, even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. The silence was so complete that Lamb could hear the wet movement of his own tongue inside his mouth. He did not speak. He had not spoken for 3 days. Ahead of him, the line of porters moved like ghosts, their figures barely visible against the deeper black of the trees. Each man maintained exact distance, close enough to follow, far enough that one mistake would not doom them all. They called it light discipline, but the phrase did not capture its cruelty. It meant no cigarettes, even for the men who had smoked since they were boys. It meant no fires, even when the mountain cold crept into their bones and refused to leave. It meant no lanterns, no matches, no glow of any kind that could rise through the canopy and whisper their position to the aircraft above. Because the aircraft were always there. Sometimes they heard them first, the distant, mechanical growl that did not belong to nature. Sometimes they saw nothing at all, only felt the tension ripple down the column as the lead handler raised his fist. Freeze! When that signal came, Lamb stopped wherever he stood, 1 foot forward, shoulders burning, breath suspended halfway between inhale and exhale. And he waited. Minutes passed like hours. His muscles trembled under the strain, but he did not shift. He did not scratch. He did not swallow. Above him, invisible in the night, American reconnaissance planes drifted slowly, their sensors drinking in the jungle, searching for patterns that did not belong. A single ember from a cigarette. A single snapped twig. A single careless sound. That was all it took. Because the jungle did not forgive exposure. He had seen what happened when discipline failed. It had been early in his first month. A young porter, barely 17, had carried a hidden scrap of tobacco. He had waited until he thought he was alone, crouched behind a fallen log, and lit it with shaking hands. The flame existed for less than 3 seconds. It was enough. Hours later, the sky returned with fury. The aircraft did not hesitate. They did not question. They were erased. Napalm fell like liquid sun, clinging to leaves, to soil, to skin. The jungle screamed. Fire did not burn here. It consumed, it devoured, it hunted oxygen and flesh alike. Lamb had watched from a drainage ditch, his face pressed into mud as the world became flame. No one spoke of the boy again. But everyone remembered. Now, months into the march, discipline was no longer an order, it was instinct. Even hunger was silent. When they stopped briefly before dawn, Lamb lowered his yoke with infinite care, easing the bamboo down so slowly it made no sound against the earth. His shoulders screamed in protest as the weight lifted, blood returning in painful waves. From his satchel, he removed his ration. Cold rice. Fermented. Its sour smell filled his nose as he pressed it into his mouth. He did not chew loudly. He did not rush. He let it dissolve slowly, mechanically. Food was fuel. Nothing more. Around him, the other porters ate in the same silence, their faces hollow, their eyes reflecting nothing. No one complained. Complaints required energy. Energy requires hope. Hope was dangerous. The march would last 6 months. 6 months without fire, without voices, without release. And yet somehow they endured. Not because they were unafraid, but because fear itself became routine. At night, when exhaustion blurred the edges of his thoughts, Lamb found himself imagining sounds that were not there. His mother called his name, the laughter of his younger brother, the simple, forgotten noise of conversation. He never answered, because even imagination felt like a risk. Somewhere above the canopy, men in aircraft studied maps filled with symbols and grids, trying to predict movement. They did not see him. They saw tonnage, logistics, supply flow. They saw a trail. They did not see the human spine bending beneath ammunition. They did not feel the bamboo cutting into flesh. They did not taste the sour rice. They did not know the cost of silence. And that silence was the true weapon. Because every step he took defied the machines designed to find him. Every breath he held preserved the illusion that nothing moved below. Every instinct he suppressed kept the trail alive. But even silence had limits. Because somewhere ahead, beyond the endless march, beyond the discipline and the fear, there would come a moment when silence would break. And when it did, the jungle would remember everything. The radio said he was alone. Specialist Daniel Mercer stared at the handset as if it had betrayed him personally. The signal intelligence receiver rested in his lap, its olive casing warm from hours of operation, its tiny speaker whispering nothing but a steady, indifferent hiss. No enemy chatter, no coded bursts, no accidental transmissions, just static. Static meant empty. Static meant safe. Static meant there was no one out there. But Mercer didn't believe it. Because the jungle did not feel empty. Somewhere beyond the wall of green, something was breathing. He sat motionless beside the base of a massive strangler fig, its roots coiled like petrified snakes, its canopy choking out the sunlight. Around him, 5 men from his long-range reconnaissance patrol team lay frozen in their positions, bodies pressed into the earth, faces streaked with mud and camouflage paint. They had been inserted 3 days earlier into this sector of Vietnam, their mission simple in theory and lethal in practice: find the enemy and remain unseen. They were hunters, or at least they were supposed to be. Sergeant Ray Harlan lay 10 meters ahead, his eyes scanning the jungle through the narrow iron sights of his rifle. He was a veteran of 2 tours, his face permanently hardened into something that resembled calm, but Mercer could see the small signs, the tension in his shoulders, the way his head turned too quickly at every sound. Harlan was listening, not to the radio, to the jungle, because the jungle was never silent. It whispered constantly, leaves brushing against each other, insects screaming their endless electric song, the distant call of birds echoing through trees. But beneath it all, there were other sounds. Sounds that didn't belong. Sounds that made no sense. A footstep where no footstep should be. A branch bending without breaking. A breath that wasn't yours. Mercer adjusted the receiver again, turning the dial with agonizing precision. The static shifted in tone but revealed nothing. According to the technology, the nearest enemy transmitter was miles away. According to technology, they were alone. But Harlan knew better. He had seen it happen before. The enemy they hunted, the soldiers of the North Vietnamese army, did not behave like conventional troops. They didn't rely on radios the same way American forces did. They moved by memory, by prearranged timing, by instinct. They carried messages on foot. They spoke in whispers. They existed in the gaps between signals, which made them invisible to machines. Harlan raised his fist slowly. The patrol froze completely. Mercer felt his pulse quicken. He waited, and then he smelled it. Tobacco. It was faint, but unmistakable. Not American tobacco. This was different. Stronger, earthier. Enemy tobacco. Mercer's mouth went dry. He looked at the receiver again, willing it to contradict his senses. It didn't. The static continued. Empty. Safe. A lie. Somewhere out there, someone was smoking. Watching them. At that same moment, miles away, Captain Thomas Greer sat inside a darkened signal intelligence trailer, surrounded by glowing equipment and humming machines. His headphones pressed tightly against his ears, his fingers adjusting frequency bands with obsessive care. He was one of the best listeners in the unit, a man trained to extract meaning from chaos. But tonight, there was nothing to extract. He monitored every known enemy channel along the sector bordering the Ho Chi Minh Trail, searching for patterns, anomalies, anything. Nothing. He leaned back, uneasy. Because absence could mean safety, or it could mean concealment. Greer had seen reports, patrols encountering enemy forces that had never appeared on signal intercept, entire units materializing out of terrain that had been electronically silent hours earlier. It wasn't supposed to work like that. American doctrine depended on awareness, detection, information dominance. Without it, the advantage disappeared. Without it, the jungle belonged to someone else. Back on the ground, Mercer felt sweat trickle down his spine. The smell of tobacco lingered. Closer now. Or maybe he was imagining it. That was the other weapon the enemy wielded. Doubt. Harlan shifted his eyes slightly, scanning the undergrowth. He saw nothing. But that meant nothing. Because the most dangerous enemy was the one who understood stillness. A sudden crack echoed in the distance. Not a gunshot. A branch. Mercer flinched. The patrol held position. Seconds passed. Minutes. Nothing followed. No attack. No movement. Just the jungle breathing again. Mercer realized something then. The enemy didn't need to fire. The enemy didn't need to move. The enemy only needed to be present. Presence alone was enough. Because presence turned hunters into prey. Mercer looked at his radio again. It continued to whisper its empty reassurance. But he no longer trusted it. And that was the beginning of the change. Because once a soldier stopped trusting his equipment, he started trusting something else. Instinct. And instinct did not operate on logic. Instinct operated on fear. Captain Greer removed his headphones slowly, staring at the silent waveform display. He couldn't prove the enemy was there. But he couldn't prove they were. And that uncertainty spread outward, infecting every patrol, every mission, every decision. Technology had promised clarity. Instead, it had delivered ambiguity. In the jungle, ambiguity was lethal. Mercer's patrol remained frozen as darkness began to creep through the trees, the light fading into a suffocating gray. He could feel it now. Not hear, not see, feel. They were being watched. Somewhere beyond the reach of radios. Beyond the reach of certainty. And in that moment, Mercer understood something no training had prepared him for. The most dangerous part of the jungle was not the enemy you could detect. It was the one you couldn't. Because that enemy lived inside your mind. And once it moved in, it never truly left. The valley did not exist on most maps. It hid beneath a permanent haze, its steep jungle walls folding inward like a clenched fist, sealing secrets beneath layers of green. From above, it appeared peaceful, untouched. But that was a lie both sides had spent weeks preparing to expose. Captain Daniel Reeves stared down at it through the scratched plexiglass of the orbiting command helicopter, his jaw tight, fingers resting on the edge of the radio console. Below him, American infantry moved in narrow columns through the elephant grass, their formation disciplined but tense. The men looked small, fragile. He could almost convince himself they were safe. Almost. The air smelled faintly of aviation fuel and hot circuitry. The rhythmic chop of rotor blades vibrated through his spine. Reaper 6, be advised, the radio crackled. Sensors confirm heavy movement inside grid sector Echo 7. Heavy movement. It was the phrase that always came before something irreversible. Reeves glanced at the intelligence officer seated beside him, a young lieutenant whose confidence had begun to erode over the past month. Numbers, Reeves asked quietly. The lieutenant hesitated. Uncertain, sir, but significant. Significant meant hundreds. On the valley floor, Captain Michael Harris felt it too. Not through radios, not through sensors. Through silence. His company moved cautiously along the jungle slope, boots sinking into damp soil, uniforms soaked with sweat. The air was suffocating. The jungle pressed against them from all sides, thick and watchful. Private First Class Gomez walked just ahead of him, rifle raised, breathing shallow. Harris could hear the metallic clink of the young man's gear with every step. Too loud. Everything felt too loud. He raised his fist. The column stopped instantly. And then, a sound. Not loud. Small. The intimate metallic click of an AK-47 bolt sliding into place. Harris's blood turned cold. Contact. The jungle exploded. Gunfire erupted from less than 20 meters away, muzzle flashes stuttering through the trees like camera flashes from hell. Men screamed, dirt kicked upward, the air filled with the snapping crack of supersonic rounds. Gomez dropped instantly, his rifle falling from his hands. Harris hit the ground, shouting into his radio. Troops in contact, multiple enemy positions, danger close. Above, Reeves heard the transmission and felt his stomach tighten. It had begun. But on the valley floor, Colonel Tran Van Bin had already been waiting. He crouched in a shallow trench, his uniform soaked through, face calm beneath the chaos. Around him, his soldiers moved with controlled aggression, their ambush unfolding exactly as planned. Weeks of preparation. Weeks of digging. Weeks of waiting. They had studied American patterns. They had learned the rhythm of their response. And they had chosen this valley for one reason alone: to nullify the sky. Bin raised his hand. His signal rippled outward, and his men surged forward. They did not stay at a distance. They closed it. 10 meters. 5 meters. Some crashed directly into American positions, rifles blazing from the hip, grenades thrown with brutal efficiency. They were hugging the belt, staying so close the Americans could smell their sweat, see the whites of their eyes. So close that air power became useless. Above, Reeves heard Harris's desperate voice. Enemy inside our perimeter, danger close, repeat danger close. Danger close. It was the phrase that stripped technology of its superiority. Reeves turned, to the Air Force liaison officer. "We can't hit that," the officer said immediately, shaking his head, "not without hitting them too." Reeves knew, but he also knew what would happen if they didn't. "Arc light is inbound," the liaison added quietly. The words hung in the air. Arc light. B-52 strikes. Massive, overwhelming, annihilating. The kind of force that erased entire grid squares. The bombers were already coming. Too late to stop. On the ground, Harris fought to maintain control. Men fired in every direction, jungle foliage shredding around them. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. He saw one of them suddenly, a young North Vietnamese soldier emerging through the smoke, rifle raised. For a moment, they locked eyes. Both men froze. Both were terrified. Both humans. Then Harris fired. The soldier fell. Harris didn't know his name. Above, the sky began to roar. A distant thunder, growing louder. Colonel Bin heard it too. He smiled faintly. He had expected this. "Withdraw," he ordered calmly. His officers relayed the command. His soldiers began to melt away. Not running. Vanishing. Back into tunnels. Into tree lines. Into the earth itself. Minutes later, the bombs arrived. The world ended. The first explosions tore open the valley floor with blinding flashes of white and orange. The shockwaves punched through the jungle, flattening trees, vaporizing everything in their path. The sound was beyond sound. It was pressure. Force. Finality. Harris lay face down, hands over his helmet, body trembling as the earth convulsed beneath him. Above, Reeves watched in horrified awe as the valley disappeared beneath towering pillars of fire and smoke. It was total destruction. Absolute. When it ended, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing survived. Or so it seemed. Hours later, reconnaissance aircraft scanned the valley. Their sensors painted a clear picture. Over 1,000 enemies were killed. The data was precise. Clinical. Victory. Days later, Harris returned to the blast zone on foot. The jungle was gone, replaced by a scar. The earth was blackened, trees reduced to skeletal stumps. The smell was unbearable. Burned soil. Burned life. He walked slowly, searching. They found 10 bodies. 10. Not 1,000. 10. Harris stared at them, confusion creeping into his bones. It didn't make sense. Above him, Reeves sat in his helicopter, listening to the report. He felt something shift inside him. A realization. They had unleashed the most powerful weapons on Earth. And still, the enemy had survived. Because they had never truly been there. They had come close. Close enough to kill. Close enough to break them. And then they vanished. The valley kept its secret. But both commanders understood what had happened. This was no longer a war of firepower versus manpower. It was a war of presence versus absence, of technology versus patience, of visibility versus invisibility. And in that hidden valley, for one brief, violent moment, the unseen had stepped into the light, only to prove they were never truly vulnerable to it.